are any of these decisions about privacy and how a policy should meet its privacy protections, does it all depend on who the state considers owns that data?
Well,
or is it uniformly accepted that it is the consumer's data and the consumer owns it?
it's absolutely not universally accepted. I think in the past that it might have been assumed to have been universally accepted. Recently, there have been a number of decisions that have relied on certain provisions in the law to state that any information that's owned by a third party no longer belongs to the consumer. Justice Sotomayor commented in a case recently that in which she dissented, and in which the majority held that indeed data was that individuals had no interest or ownership in their own personal data if it was owned by a third party. And she stated that she felt that it was very ill-conceived, and that as time went forward, that this third-party doctrine would prove to be very ill-suited to the digital age. So it's not at all a foregone conclusion, but it's something that's highly controversial.
Let me turn it over to Lee to comment.
I just wanted to say that, I mean, we have in the law that there are very, very different ways of looking at economic sort of ownership of information versus sort of a privacy type right. I mean, we're all familiar with copyright, patents, and trademarks. You know, these are sort of classic forms of intellectual property where you actually have an exploitable economic right. But in the privacy area, it tends to be not so well defined. And indeed, the people often want to say, well, gee, you know, isn't the answer to privacy simply to say that the individual owns the data that comes from them or is about them or so on? It would take a long time to sort of go into why that doesn't work in the law, but basically it doesn't work in the law sort of for a couple of reasons. The first is that in this country we do have a First Amendment as well, and the First Amendment automatically means that a person who gets information, if you tell me something, unless you bind me via a promise, I have a First Amendment right to repeat that. So that's sort of one thing. Now, how that operates in the commercial context is a little different, but it's messy because you've got newspapers, you've got media, you've got all sorts of institutions that are sort of in between the sort of standard corporation now and the individual. The second is that if you believe that it's sort of like a property right, then it's very, very easy to commoditize it and sell it and transfer it away. And one of the problems in all of this, you know, as Chris has been saying, is that people will agree to, you know, if you said something about, well, gee, either you agree to this term or you can't be on Facebook, you know, most people will be on Facebook, even though it's going to cost them information, and even though more and more of us know that it does. So, you know, from a privacy advocate standpoint, it's sort of a consent is, the whole sort of notice and choice or consent model is a very flawed approach. It's not actually what we think of as the be-all and end-all of privacy protection, because it is so easy to get consent from someone, and then it goes on. That's why we're always looking to statutes and various other kinds of ways that avoid the, you know, what else can I do? It's like, you know, consent in a medical situation. You know, if you're going in for, you know, if you're dying of cancer, or even, you know, if your arm is broken, you know, the doctor can probably extract almost any promise from you, right? I mean, because you want to get fixed. So we actually see a lot of strong public policy reasons to say limit the ability of people to make a deal that will ultimately not be good for them. But that area of privacy law is currently very poorly developed.
So I won't give you any opinions on what I think about this. I'll just point out two things. The state of Texas has a law that says the customer owns the data. We go up 35 to the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma has a law that says the utility owns the data.
Yep.
If you talk to individual utilities, whether or not there are rules in place or not in place, my guess is most utilities will say, informally, utilities own the data. In California, the general point is we haven't made a statement either way. the general direction that we have is the customer controls who has access to the data. That the ownership question is not necessarily a relevant question around access, as long as the customer is one who has the control over the access.
So that kind of comes back to the monetization issue, is if I give the utility consent to do with it what they want, can't they charge for it? And at that point, it's more of a fairness thing almost than a privacy issue.
No, I would go even further. If the customer owns the data, then it is the utility that has to pay the customer for the use of that data, even for its own internal functions, because they're making money.
Right. Are there any
off better
mechanisms
energy
of
efficiency.
you can opt in and we'll do some profit sharing with you because we're selling your data about you,
Not
to
even
give you a
selling it to
discount?
somebody else, their own internal use.
Right,
If
their
the
own
customer
internal use.
owns the data, they are gonna
Right.
be using that
How far does
data
this go?
for their own
Because
economic
that is
benefit.
the constraint, or that's the tension here, is
Yeah.
that the utility needs the data for basic purposes under the franchise in the state. Procurement, billing, settlements, all sorts of stuff that, I'm not a lawyer, I shouldn't go so far along.
Don't have to worry about it, no one's holding you
It
to
makes
that.
it complicates the relationship between the customer and the utility
Yeah.
if the customer's put in a outright ownership position.
So California sidesteps the whole issue by just saying access.
It's the utility can't sell it out.
So if I'm in Oklahoma, like you said, up 35 from Texas, where it is explicitly consumer owned, if I'm the utility and I own that data, what's stopping me from giving it to third parties for money? Is there?
In
And
Oklahoma,
so
I
it's,
have no
Except
idea.
specific laws in specific states.
right. So it sounds like California again being, first is what the most is skewed in terms of its ability to limit that temptation and that monetization. These days, computing power is so cheap, storage is so cheap. It's almost, how would you not want to monetize that? And if you did, would you tell the customer and say, well, we're selling your data, and again, we know you turn on a hair dryer at 3 in the morning. I mean, it could be that granular. As of 2009, people are already doing research on the little spikes, if the data is granular or not. And that was 3-4 years ago. So, given that you can do that, it is possible to have those signatures. Storage is so cheap and getting cheaper. Processing power is so cheap and getting cheaper. Where does so we talked initially, maybe the first half of the panel about surveillance and subpoenas from the government. I'm at least as concerned about malicious targeting by some folks that may not want to give me tax breaks on energy efficient windows, but other things. Is that legit, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think my other panelists may have something interesting to say about it, but I'd say that one of the only protections against that really, Paul, is something I call the creepiness factor, which is kind of what, Chris Shepard, you were describing, which is when you get some type of commercial solicitation, and so obviously some business interest thinks they're incredibly smart because they've targeted this and they've paid a lot of money to do it, and instead the effect it has on you is a complete creepiness that you're completely turned off by it. I mean, has anybody else had that sort of creepiness factor where you've gotten a solicitation where you realize exactly the source of that solicitation was the sale of your private data? It's very off-putting. So I think that's one of the only protections against the kind of thing you're talking about.
I think the problem with that is that if you're probably 30 or under, certainly 20 or under, that digital generation, the digital natives, grew up in a situation where there is always Facebook and Foursquare and Twitter and location and wireless and social, and it's just part of life.
But Sarah, once that's happened, it's too late.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no, data wants to be free, period. It
wants to be sold.
Put it this way, you cannot stop entropy no matter how much you try, period.
I
But
disagree.
the fact
I
is,
disagree.
once that happens and you see that happening and you're like, okay, that really pisses me off that someone sold my personal data.
No one.
What do I do about it other than just bang my fist and curse at the sky? Old man yells at cloud. It doesn't do much for me.
Well, what you do is you elect officials and you support efforts to legally limit privacy. Lee, do you have some other?
Which is slow.
Well-
Meanwhile, my data's leaking out to multiple
It already
parties.
leaks.
20 years later, you get a credit card system.
There's a certain amount of once the toothpaste is out of the tube, yes, it is hard to get that particular part back. I've got kids, and so as a privacy advocate, you know, you pretty much have to think about what you're doing is something that you're going to try to make it better for them. It's too late for me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to sacrifice to them, you know, their privacy on the altar of some sort of false god. I mean, that's just not, that doesn't work for me. You know, we were lucky in California with the smart grid situation because we had not only one bill, we actually had 2 smart grid bills in the legislature that session. I'm not even sure why both senators were really pushing the bills, but we actually, EFF was actually supporting an even more detailed and stronger bill than SB 1476. And it didn't go through, but it was very clear that the legislature was thinking about the privacy issues raised by the smart grid, and I think that made it a lot easier for the commission to move in that direction. I mean, in fact, the commission had to do something after 1476. In other states where there wasn't any legislative action, it's very unclear to me what would happen, because there clearly is this great sense that this data is extremely valuable and can be used for a lot. I mean, there are a couple of different paradigms of sort of data usage out here in sort of the big data world, right? I mean, if you remember 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and there are a lot of folks who had instinctive creepiness factors around what somebody might be doing for law enforcement or counterterrorism surveillance, but you know, there's also this very green surveillance that goes in the area of, say, health data, your movements in terms of like congestion pricing, and then of course the energy data is another example. In here, you know, the ends that are being touted for what people can do with this kind of information is public health. It's, you know, greater energy efficiency, less pollution, all of these very good progressive and liberal ends as compared to what you might automatically associate with Dick Cheney or John Ashcroft or something. And that just spins it in a different way. But at the end of the day, the actual privacy issue is, to my mind, exactly the same. Because what you are talking about is taking lots and lots of disparate points of data, connecting the dots, looking at patterns of behavior and being able to make inferences about people. And, you know, so you have this danger, whether it's a surveillance that's, you know, at least as a privacy advocate, you know, to me it's surveillance, whether it's green or, you know, some other color.
We're almost out of time, so maybe we can have a 1-minute kind of summary and quick prediction from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it to questions.
I don't need to summarize.
I was just going to do an anecdote. The other day I was at home having dinner and I got a knock on the door, and it was a solar installer company. And the first thing he says is he pulls out his iPad and puts a screen from me. He goes, "Is this your name?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "Okay, great. I can talk to you. You're the homeowner." In essence, he has all of the property records for at least my neighborhood, driving around the neighborhood, finding out who has an optimum roof to put solar on the house. There's no usage information at all on it. It's just property records, driving around trying to match it to sell me a product of putting solar on my roof. And, you know, there's your creepiness. That's publicly available data.
How'd you feel about that? How'd you feel? Freaked
It's
out?
weird because since I am a regulator, I know what's all going on. And that was my first question. My first question is, how did you get that? And it's publicly available. You just go down to City Hall and get it all. And so as we think about Patrick's who all data wants to be free, on the one hand, if you're a solar provider, wouldn't you just love to pair building information with usage information? So not only so you don't have to waste your time driving around the neighborhood, you get usage information, property information paired over Google Maps, so you know which way the house is facing, and you go right to that house. That would make your job a whole lot easier. But that does not protect customer privacy. You know, in California, Article 1, Section 1 of the California Constitution includes the right to privacy. So privacy is a fundamental right in the state of California. And so, yes, wouldn't it be so much easier in a green economy to be able to pair all this together? But we still have to balance the needs to protect customer privacy.
That is public information.
I want to hear questions from the audience. I'm going to take my minute to see if there's any questions from anybody from the audience. No, not a single question.
The best question gets a shake weight.
That's right.
Okay.
Come on, Patrick.
There'll be
Leave it
questions
nine
that-
that the whole time.
I've got a bunch of them.
Yeah, there'll be
already.
questions on this
Is
one.
that a
So
difference?
I agree, fundamentally agree with Patrick, that data wants to be free. It's like water, you put water in any vessel, it will eventually get out of that vessel. It wants to be free, it will find a way.
Chris, can I add to that? Data wants to be free, and organizations like Google that have more money than God can transform perspectives.
Yeah, they can
That's
make
a
it
big
free.
difference.
We can now have driverless cars in California.
But we
because
can't,
of
but
Google,
we can't
so
get
that's
access to
a-
smart grid data.
Yeah,
So
That's for now.
So there is a difference between data and information. I'll just throw that out there. After you take data and do something with it, it becomes information. Information is much more valuable than data. Data has a value, especially in operations, but information is incredibly valuable. It has incredible value. So, but what I want to do is we're talking about reactive measures here. That's pretty much what we've been talking about this whole time we've been in the panel. But this really begs the point for proactive measures. This is where utilities, and PUCs, look ahead and go, well, wait a minute, we either have a problem, gonna have a problem, or perceiving this new technology, what do we do to stem off the problems that we can identify? So I'm gonna give kudos to Ontario, Canada. They have a program called Privacy by Design. It's very well accepted in Europe. Europe's ahead of the US, go figure. And they have basically 7 tenets. This is my minute, I'll go through this, all right? So really, what they say is, privacy needs to be proactive, not reactive. It needs to be preventative, not remedial. There are bad actors that play in this game, and that's why we have laws, legislation, et cetera. But we should be building it in. Utilities should be building this in fundamentally from the get-go, so the customers ask the question, they have an answer. Privacy needs to be by default, not added on. If you're creating software or hardware, whatever you're doing, if it's policies, procedures, regulation, privacy's got to be there by default. Privacy embedded into the design. It has to have full functionality. This goes back to the privacy and security. You look at privacy first and see what do we have to do to secure that. But you have to be able to define what you're going to be calling as privacy. It has to have end-to-end life cycle protection. You gather it, you share it, you use it. When do you get rid of it? How do you get rid of it? And this goes back to your question about selling. Once you're done, what do you do? Just sell it off? You shouldn't. Next, visibility and transparency. This is where the utilities, commissions, et cetera, all the players in the game, vendors included, need to be transparent about what they're doing, what they're collecting, where it's going. The consumer really should have an opportunity, a portal, groups to go to, get questions answered, so they feel comfortable and can buy into the changing environment, technical environment we have in the electric industry. And then fundamentally and finally is respect for users' privacy. We sit up here as a panel, you sit there as experts in your field, and somehow in this room we elevate ourselves above the particular personal privacy issues that we all face. Chris, you mentioned it, somebody came to your door, all of a sudden privacy hits home. So we've talked about good things here. In leaving, I guess I would just say, we can't forget that all of this is us. And when we're done with our jobs, it's us and it's our privacy that's being affected.
I just want to add one comment because you mentioned privacy by design, and that's something that one of the things that we in CDT thought about very hard in trying to, in wanting to lobby the PUC to do. We ended up not making sort of a tactical decision that would be trying to push a mountain uphill. But I mean, there are honestly ways that you can use crypto and a lot of really interesting sort of de-identification techniques to design in a lot more privacy into smart meters and smart grid. You know, the people have suggested various kinds of tricks for aggregation and anonymization. There's also Microsoft Research is actually doing a tremendous amount of technical work in the area of anonymous utility billing. So there's actually a whole lot of potential in that area for, you know, we've talked to like Landis Gear about, you know, how hard would it be to do sort of a pilot project for some kind of Microsoft type technology, you know, anonymization, and try it out in some small co-op or something. Right now the numbers just don't work, but I mean there's a lot of opportunity out there. What I always worry about when you're installing it, when you are rolling out a huge sort of base of older technology, that it locks you in an awful way to the privacy problems that you have, and then you can't actually upgrade and take advantage of how technological design might actually improve the privacy situation. We see this on the web, right? The web was designed to allow websites to get a lot of information just through sort of passive surveillance, and then we added cookies to it, which again allowed you to track any user agent, any browser with a persistent ID. And so now that companies and businesses have all sort of accepted and assumed that this kind of data will be available on the web, then any attempt to say, well, you know, let's not collect that data, sort of ruins all of their business models. So you've got all these sort of problematic economic incentives that I worry about are going to happen in this field.
Any last minute questions from the audience?
No questions?
Okay, very good. Thanks everybody. Tien,
Thank you very
Chris
much.
Villarreal, Sarah Cortes, and Chris Shepard.
So we have evaluations on the table again for this panel. If you don't mind taking a moment to fill those out, we'd appreciate it. Thank you so much, panelists. We have a reception tonight, 5 to 7. It's going to be right out here on the mezzanine where we've had lunch and breakfast. So please join us out there. Got a lot of great stuff starting out tomorrow morning as well, so we look forward to seeing you in the morning. All right, thank you.
You were terrific.
No one did. Mainly, well, you weren't on the call the other day. No one
That's right. You were
I apologize, Chris. I didn't.
I saw your name in the thing, but I figured
Exactly. But they got mixed up.
I thought they had a switcheroo in the schedule because maybe some travel issues or something. I didn't know you were still on. So I apologize.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I think I did know that you
Smart meter?
It is.
It is a smart meter.
It's better to wait to go. I'm surprised.
I pressed the